greatest honors for me is meeting the veterans who visit Washington, D.C. through the incredible efforts of the Honor Flight Network. Having the opportunity to visit with members of the greatest generation who make the journey to Washington, often with high school students who are learning firsthand about their service and that history, so they can see their memorial, is a humbling and uplifting experience for me and for all of us. To watch these men and women share their stories, many for the first time, is incredibly moving. When meeting these members of the greatest generation, you understand how befitting that label is for these humble men and women who stood in face of tyranny and triumph. We see this same courage and resolve demonstrated daily by the good men and women currently serving in our armed forces throughout the world. We see acts of uncommon valor and great sacrifice for a cause and a deep belief in something bigger than just one person. So we honor all the American men and women who gave their lives for their country since our nation's founding. Susan Collins just referred to that in her very fine speech. We honor the more than 300,000 living veterans from the greatest, from those folks to the greatest generation, and we honor the families of those who are here and are serving. Speaking of the greatest generation, Mr. President, I have the honor to be the chairman of the Eisenhower Memorial Commission, the memorial which pays tribute to Kansas's favorite son and Ike's leadership, both as Supreme Allied Commander, where he saved Western democracy, and the 34th President of the United States, where he gave us 8 years of peace and prosperity. This memorial will serve as a symbol for all generations of the promise of America and what our values make possible here and around the world. Now, we were supposed to dedicate this memorial this month, but like everything else, the pandemic put those plans on hold. When we dedicated the memorial in September, we hope to have many World War II veterans attending, including Kansas's other favorite son, Senator Bob Dole. While our debt to these heroes can never be repaid, I know that my fellow Kansans agree that these liberators and defenders of democracy deserve our utmost respect and gratitude. I'm going to quote from General Eisenhower and when he was president and following that. There is nothing wrong with America that the faith, love of freedom, intelligence, and energy of her citizens cannot cure. I hope that those words by Ike at that particular time could ring true in this body, and more especially those of us who are privileged to serve in this body. There is another quote I will repeat from Winston Churchill, who said, "Kites rise highest against the wind, not with it." We have seen a lot of talk about the pandemic, and those winds have been a bit partisan, to say the least. I would hope that we would stop for a moment and honor Memorial Day in the true way that we should do that. I would also close by saying that, in the words of Ronald Reagan, freedom is only one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. Those who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. I think President Reagan gives us a great deal of insight. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Upon close observation, I see the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President,
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise today.
Order in a call, Senator.
I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'd ask with the proceedings of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today concerning the tragic death of a young Virginian named Bijan who was shot and killed by 2 U.S. Park police officers over 2 years ago. While this tragic incident occurred, as I mentioned, more than 2 years ago, many questions remain unanswered regarding the circumstances of Bijan's death. Unfortunately, the Department of Interior has failed to answer many of the basic questions that I have asked about the night of Bijan's death and subsequent actions the National Park Service has taken following the shooting. Of November of last year, I wrote the department and requested information about the U.S. Park Police's use of force and vehicle pursuit policies, as well as information about the Park Service's response in the aftermath of Bijan's shooting. Unfortunately, there's been no response. The department found time to do some PR, though. They provided copies of the updated use of force and vehicle pursuit policies to the Washington Post earlier this year. But I still have not received a response to my letter that was sent over 6 months ago. To this point, the department has failed to answer many basic questions about this incident, questions that I have asked, as well as my friend, the senior senator from Iowa. Questions about the incident, such as, did the department open an internal affairs inquiry into the incident to see if any violations of Park Police policy occurred? What is the timeline for such an investigation? Is the U.S. Park Police conducting a thorough after-action review of the incident? What is the status of the Park Police officers involved in the incident? Are they on administrative leave, desk duty, or are they back on patrol? These are basic questions. If the Department of Interior had any interest in transparency, they could answer them today. The Gazar family deserves answers about what happened to Bijan. The pain they have experienced over the last 2 years is immeasurable. As if the premature death of their son wasn't bad enough, they've waited 2 years for answers from a federal government that has failed completely to adequately respond to this tragedy. Mr. President, I'm not going to rest until the Gazar family has the answers they deserve about what happened to Bijan that night. If the department wants to ignore these basic questions I've asked, if they want to disregard legitimate congressional oversight, then there will be consequences until their action changes. In February, I voted against Catherine McGregor's nomination to be Deputy Secretary of the Interior. And I said very clearly at that time, if the Department of Interior continues to ignore my questions about the killing of Bijan Gazar, then I would hold up future Interior nominees. For this reason, I'm today placing a hold on the nomination of Lanny Erdos to serve as Director of the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement within the Department of Interior. And if we don't get answers to the legitimate questions that I and other members of this body and members of the House have raised about the shooting of Bijan Gazar, I'm prepared to hold up even more nominees. This is not something I take lightly. Holding up nominees should always be a last resort. But I've been patient, Bijan's family has been patient, and still the Department of Interior has been silent. For Bijan's family, 2 years is too long to wait. They deserve answers about what happened the night their son was shot and killed. I urge the department to swiftly provide substantive answers to my outstanding questions regarding the death of Bijan and the department's response. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.